TopMedTalk.
This is TopMedTalk, the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. The EBPOM World Congress is taking place this year between the 7th and the 9th of July at the British Library in London. Check out ebpom.org now.
Hello and welcome to TopMedTalk. This is one of our perioperative profiles where we're talking to the leaders in perioperative medicine about their careers and how they became such inspiring and successful researchers. And it's with great pleasure today that I welcome Professor Denny Levett. Welcome, Denny.
Thank you, Kate. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So before we get started on your life and career, can you tell us what your current roles are?
Sure. I am a clinical academic in Southampton in the south of the United Kingdom. My clinical job involves perioperative medicine and leading a perioperative medicine service. And I also work in adult intensive care. And then from a research perspective, my research interests pretty much mirror my clinical interests, and they're very much about the management of high-risk surgical patients, optimizing patients for major surgery. And then I have a national leadership role as the director of the Centre for Perioperative Care, which is a centre which is multi-professional and multidisciplinary, which was established 6 years ago now in the United Kingdom to promote integrated, multidisciplinary, patient-centred, evidence-based perioperative care. It's had a sterling start led by Dave Selwyn, one of my anaesthetic colleagues, and I took over just before Christmas this year. It's been a time of transition because everybody's finished the end of their 6-year term, and we're just working on the strategy going forward. Dave and his colleagues did a fantastic job in establishing CPOC's reputation, both in the UK and in fact abroad. We've had a role in developing a lot of clinical guidelines and guidance, which are very pragmatic and differ from many of the academic published guidance in that they cover the entire surgical pathway from point of contemplation through to full recovery, and are aimed not just at physicians, for example, but also the perioperative support team and allied health professionals. And I think those have been really helpful in trying to establish pathways as we try and transform the pathways for perioperative care to get earlier access to patients so that we are able to optimize them and to support them in their decision-making before major surgery, which has been a change from our traditional practice. So going forward, we want to build on that. I think we feel that the guidance has helped us, but there's still quite a big implementation gap. We heard about the difference between knowing what we should do and actually doing it in real life from the plenary speaker here at the World Congress in Morocco. And I think that's something we see on the ground. So we're thinking very much about supporting implementation. And again, to support that, we need a different probably and a bigger workforce in perioperative care. I think that needs to be probably physician-led, but not purely physician-delivered. And so we are supporting education with a new diploma in perioperative care and training for allied health professionals in the areas of prehab and the like. So look forward to that in the future.
And so I guess that pivots us right back to the start. Can you share where you grew up and went to school and why you decided to study medicine?
I grew up in a small market town in East Sussex called Rye. I'm one of 2 girls. I have an older sister who's 2 years older. And my parents used to run a small hotel in Rye, and we were there until I was about 8 or 9. And then they sold that hotel and bought into a pub. So I grew up in my early years in a small hotel and then a pub. I went to the local village school, and both of my parents had not been to university, so no one in the family had been to university. There was no history of medicine in the family at all. And then when I was about just under 10, essentially they lost their business, they went bankrupt, and we were in a very difficult financial situation as a family. We were homeless for a bit and then were supported by the state in a council house. So it was a big change for us as children. I think back on that, and I've reflected on that for both my sister and I think it probably was a lesson learnt early in the importance of financial stability and making sure that you're in a career where you can support yourself, interestingly. And it turned out that both my sister and I, fortuitously for us, were academically able, so school was something we were good at.
I think gifted might be a better word.
Well, it may be. You always wonder about those things. And, well, actually, interestingly for me in particular, I had an older sister, Blythe, as I said, who was exceptionally academically. She came, as I seem to recall, top in every single subject at school from the first day to the last. So if you're following in that footsteps, you don't really perceive yourself as being particularly academic or able, because you've got a hard act to follow, as it were. She wasn't particularly interested in sport, so I'd focused on that for quite a while and did a lot of sport when I was at school. And because my parents had got into this difficult financial situation and the local school wasn't very good, I have to say that although they hadn't been to university, my father in particular had come from a very poor background from the slums of London. He was 50 when he had me, so he'd grown up before the NHS, before the welfare state, had lost 4 of his siblings in the influenza epidemic. And
Golly.
He left school at 14, but he was a great intellect, actually, for someone who had very little formal education, and put massive value on education and academic achievement. And that was definitely an important currency in our household, which, when I reflect as well, I guess is probably why Blythe and I were both quite focused on that. He found out about this scheme in the UK at the time, which was called the Assisted Places Scheme, which is where the government, in fact, funded bright children from less well-off backgrounds to go to private school. And it was a competitive process. And in fact, both my sister and I applied to a private secondary school on this Assisted Places Scheme. And it's a means-tested scheme because of the financial situation we were in at the time. We had an entirely free secondary education at private school. It was also completely against my father's principles, who was very left-wing and felt that private education was totally not a good thing. But it turned out, when it came to his own children, it turned out to be a good thing. So we did go off there. But I think as well, because of that situation, I felt very fortunate to be in that situation and have that opportunity. And it seemed really important to me to make the most of it and, study quite hard, work hard. Had a lot of fun at school. I was very sporty as well, but I had a great time in that environment and did well in my school exams, and then went off to Cambridge to study medicine. And in terms of when I decided to study medicine, it was about when I was 11 or 12. And to be honest, it was a good friend of mine whose father was a doctor, and then she was talking about maybe doing medicine, and I was quite gifted at science. And then I talked to her more and more about it, and I thought, actually, this sounds like a great career. It's interesting. I quite like people. And so I went home and said to my parents, I think I might want to do medicine. And if I'm honest, I didn't really know very much about what it was actually going to involve. You have this sort of idea about what medicine might be like. I think I went and spent a week doing work experience in a GP practice. It turned out I was good at science. I was doing well enough at school to be able to think about applying. And so it seemed like I was almost on this track, and off I went to Cambridge to read medicine with not a lot of clue about what it would involve, if I'm really honest. And the first 3 years in Cambridge are very science-based. It's a very traditional medical school course. You do 3 years essentially in the laboratories with the natural sciences students. So in 3 years of medical school, you don't really spend very much time, or we certainly didn't back then, with patients or in the hospital. But I do think what I learned in Cambridge was a real love of science, inquisitiveness. They were very interested in developing people who wanted to be academics and researchers, and the approach to learning in a place where, there is a fantastic history.
What was it like going to a place that had been there for 1,000 years or whatever it was?
It was fantastic. I had a really good time on all fronts. I think perhaps like the first term when you first pitch up, you are a little bit worried. Imposter syndrome, I think, is at the forefront of your mind. Because
everyone there is posh, aren't they?
There were more private school people, and there were a greater proportion back then, and now that has changed very dramatically since I went there in the early 1990s. And people often are worried about that and think about that, but my experience was what was foremost in people's mind actually was academia and then having fun. And people really didn't mind about what your background was. People respected people who were bright. And that was quite different to some school environments where you get sort of picked upon sometimes for being the bright, keen one.
Yeah.
The great thing about being at Cambridge is that everybody was in that space, and it was cool. There wasn't a lot of focus on where you went to school, where you came from. You got supervisions from the people who wrote the textbooks. So the way you learn there, which I think is a fantastic way of learning, you have big lectures, but for each of your subjects, once a week, you have a small group. In sciences, maybe 4 of you with a tutor. So you have small group learning on top of your lectures and you write an essay a week in each subject. And that was a great way to learn. And you were taught by people who were writing books, as I say. So that was exciting, or who'd done the research. And then at the same time, there's a load of sport and a lot of fun. And the college system makes it really easy to meet people and make friends. It makes it all a smaller environment. You live together in one place. You have your supervisions there and you do sport there. So yeah, I had a really good time. I think it inspired me. Equally, at that point, I was very focused on becoming a doctor. Although I was inspired by the research environment, I think I knew quite early on I didn't want to be in lab science. And there was a lot of that, obviously, if you're in a preclinical science department. I liked physiology best, which I think, came out later rather than the biochemistry and extracting DNA. That was less exciting to me. But I think it made me think I want to do this at some point, but I want to finish on be a doctor first.
So you did your internship, and did you go straight into anaesthesia and intensive care training, or did you take some deviations along the way?
So I took a lot of deviations, which I don't regret at all. I'd spent, in the UK, we call them junior, well, they've now become residents, but junior doctors. I was a junior doctor for 19 years. And apart from 6 months, that was all working full time. So you can tell from that, I didn't take a very direct route.
Well, it went via the Caribbean to the top of Mount Everest and back to the UK, I think. Can you give us a few highlights from that journey?
I moved actually to Oxford University to do my clinical. And so I did my initial postgraduate training in Oxford, and it was really clear to me early on that I did not want to be a surgeon. I really enjoyed the sort of diagnostic side of things, and I really enjoyed acute medicine. And so I had thought I was going to be a physician. So I went through that pathway, then moved up to London. And in my rotation as a physician, as what we used to call senior house officers then, I went and did a job at the end on intensive care at the Middlesex Hospital, which, as it turns out, profoundly affected the rest of my life in lots of ways. So I was there for 6 months and I absolutely loved it because I realised it combined all the bits I liked about medicine, as in you saw the acute medicine and all the acute and the seriously ill people. You didn't get involved, which we sometimes did on the medical take, with an awful lot of social problems. But at that point in time, I think I decided I didn't like doing outpatients, interestingly enough.
I agree completely, yes.
And I had felt I'd been going through the medical specialties and hadn't found the one that I totally felt like it fit. And then I ended up in critical care. And I was also there at the Middlesex when, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a bombing campaign in central London. And I happened to be on the night of the Soho pub bomb, which was a profoundly affecting experience as well, in that we were overwhelmed, but everybody pulled together. It was a very hard time, but also a very good time. And it made me just think at the end of it, this is definitely what I want to do. But at that point in the UK, there wasn't a training pathway for critical care. It wasn't a separate specialty. What I also felt after that 6 months is I didn't want to do more critical care until I got a bit better at the whole airway side of things. As a physician, that was alarming if you didn't really know how to manage it. And I spoke to several of the consultants at the Middlesex. John Goldstone actually was an anaesthetist who was really helpful in this decision-making and said, frankly, at the minute, you need anaesthetic skills, and it's probably easier going into critical care via anaesthesia. And so I decided I would do next an anaesthetic rotation, so the early training for that. But I was feeling a bit exhausted because I'd just done the medical exams, and in those days we were still doing sort of 120-hour weeks and 1 and 2 rotations. So I decided I needed some time doing something else. By this time I was actually very interested in diving, and I'd done a lot of time on remote trekking. And so I got an anaesthetic rotation, but I delayed it for a year and then went off to be an expedition doctor on a number of marine biology expeditions for 3 months, which were uninhabited, and we were trying to establish a marine park. And then I went to southern Tanzania and worked with an organisation that was trying to establish the state of the reefs and commercial fish stocks. And then I went to Madagascar, had an amazing experience, really fantastic time. I enjoyed the diving, but I enjoyed the expedition medicine a bit. And during that process of trying to prepare myself, I discovered there wasn't really very much in the way of expedition medicine courses at that point in time. So I got involved with establishing an expedition medicine course in the UK. And then for the next 5 years, worked for an expedition company, going all over the world as the expedition doctor, which was fabulous. So I did whitewater rafting in Guatemala. I went to Nepal. I did dog sledding in the Arctic Circle and a lot of interesting things. So, yeah, I really, really enjoyed doing that. It was not something you got paid for, but you tended to go for free by donating your skills as a medic. And I learned a lot about, being in a remote environment, and realised largely with expedition medicine that the challenge isn't really delivering care remotely, it's deciding before you go, where is the nearest medical facility? Realistically, how long does it take to get there? And based on that, what you can and can't do. So starting CPR halfway up Mount Everest, for example, is probably not a good thing because you're not going to stop. So, that year was a fantastic year. And I came back from Africa at the end of that year and into an anaesthesia rotation at UCL. And in that period, actually at the end of the ICU job before I went, is where I met Monty Mythen, who I have to say was responsible for a lot of my research career subsequently, who was a fantastic mentor. And I remember him saying to me, actually, because I did my first research job in the little spell before I went off to Africa, he said, I hear you're going to take up anaesthesia and that you've got nothing to do for the next couple of months. What are you planning to do? And I said, well, I was going to do some locums. And he said, well, how about some research? And I said, oh, well, what sort of thing's that? And he asked me to be the sort of data collector on a grant which was looking at risk scoring from age, so the ASA score, which I'd never heard of at that point in time as a physician. So we were collecting data from various sources about ASA score and comparing them and then looking at outcomes. And this was part of actually Mike Grocot's first grant. So I was Mike's data collector on one of his early grants and working as a research fellow with Mike and with Monty. And Mike subsequently became my husband, but also in that period when Monty was mentoring Mike, Mike was one of his first research fellows, and subsequently Remini was another. So he's had
Melanie Munasinghe, the current chair at UCLH.
Yeah, and Dan Martin, the current chair at Plymouth. So he's had massive impact on clinical academics across the UK. Very much had the approach of mentoring to give you a lot of flexibility, which I really, valued, because I was really keen to do research, but I wanted to do something that was sort of something I was interested in, was my idea. I didn't really want to walk into a project where someone's already got grant funding and you deliver the research, essentially. And Monty was all about giving us plenty of rope to go and hang ourselves if we came up with a slightly nutty idea. So at the time, it was Kevin Fong, who was a house officer, who is another professor at UCL.
Another TopMedTalk fan favourite.
Yes, so he was a junior house officer, I was a senior house officer, and Mike Grocott was a registrar. So we went to see him. Mike was very interested in altitude and extreme environment medicine. I was interested in diving medicine. And Kevin Fong was interested in space medicine at that period of time and had come back and done an astrophysics degree before. So we went to see Monty and said, we want to set up an extreme environment physiology BSc. Most people would have thought we were slightly eccentric and why would he support that? But he was incredibly supportive. We told him these great plans and he said, well, go off and speak to the people you can use. And then we did set that up, and Kevin and Mike led that BSc, and that BSc evolved into the Centre for Aviation, Space and Extreme Environment Medicine at UCL. And that evolved into Extreme Everest, which was my next distraction.
So a team went up Everest and did all sorts of experiments at different altitudes, and some of the climbers, including Mike, I think, made it to the summit. But there's great pictures of you doing experiments in tents in this extreme environment that I've seen. It looked so exciting. How did it come to be, and what was your role?
Well, it was an amazing experience, to be honest, from start to finish. Probably one of the things I'm most proud of in that we managed to deliver it successfully without anybody coming to harm. And it was a huge logistical challenge. So, we at the Centre for CASE, we call it for short, the Extreme Environment Centre, thought we would like to do a field project. And we were all intensive care, stroke anaesthesia clinicians. And one of the things that struck us at the time was it was quite challenging doing critical care research because units are small and it was difficult to tease out sometimes the impact of a single factor in a complex patient with a variety of underlying morbidity. And so we were interested in the idea of looking at variability to hypoxia exposure in patients and thought it was a reasonable idea to use as a model looking at performance of human systems in border conditions at the extremes, essentially. And so our idea was that we could take normal individuals to expose them to hypoxia in a graded way. And rather than looking at hypoxia-related illness, which a lot of altitude research had focused on, we were more looking at variability in adaptation. And so the unique thing about the Extreme Everest project was that rather than taking a bunch of altitude experienced climbers and measuring their physiology, what we did was take a large group of healthy volunteers and do essentially a dose response experiment. But what that meant for us was that we took 220 general public from London to Everest Base Camp, which is, for those of you not that familiar, about 5,300 meters in altitude. So the available inspired oxygen there is about a third of sea level. And then for a small group, we wanted to look at more invasively and at more extreme levels of hypoxia. So there were 15 of us who were subjects at Everest Base Camp who were there, who had more invasive procedures. And then we had a summit team of 10 whose aim was to go to the summit of Mount Everest and take an arterial blood sample from the summit. Now that whole project led the expedition by Mike Grocott. And then myself and Dan Martin were the research leads. And I was also the expedition doctor. So that chestnut again, which actually was quite a big challenge for 60 doctors. So we had 220 general public. We had 60 researchers, majority of whom were clinician researchers, but some basic scientists. And we set up laboratories in Kathmandu, Namche, which is at 3,000 meters, Ferrochet at 4,000 meters, Everest Base Camp at 5,300 meters. And then for the extreme science, we had 3 labs on the mountain, and there was a team of 15 who climbed on the mountain. So I was one of the climbers, but I was not on the summit team. And so I carried out the testing on the mountain, so including exercise testing, arterial blood gas sampling. And we did that partly because we knew, as such a large concentration of doctors, that, if there were events and not just our team, but other people's team that became unwell, we obviously had a moral responsibility and would want to get involved in rescues, but we didn't want to derail the whole science. So these 5 of us who were on the climbing team, our role was to help medically and also to conduct the science so that the climbers could focus on being subjects and actually getting up the mountain. And everybody, our ethics from UCL at the time, suggested that anybody that was going to be on the summit team doing the more invasive testing had to be a doctor so that they could understand, but also were able to climb and so knew the risks of climbing. So we had put a criterion in place because we know that performance at very extreme altitude is only really predicted by previous performance, that everybody on that summit team had to have successfully summited a mountain above 8,000 meters without any illness previously. And Dan and I had the job of arranging all the lab equipment and designing the labs, which was quite a challenge. So we took 26 tons of research equipment in about 1,000 blue barrels. And I'm proud to say that everything turned up in the right place, which is quite an achievement.
That's amazing.
We were helped by some ex-army logistics people, but we had the biggest spreadsheet in the universe and spent a long time trying to work out how many blood tubes we needed at each place. But we had cardiopulmonary exercise testing, cardiac output monitoring, arterial blood gas sampling. We did a lot of blood testing, looking at various things. And so, it was a lot of kit and it took a lot of organisation. And, we were looking after a volunteer population that went up to the age of 78, I think was our oldest volunteer, and exposing them to exercise at extreme environments. So it was quite a challenge, and there were some medical issues along the way.
Incredible. So just was listening to you, wondering how you go from being an expedition doctor to being an expert in prehabilitation. And I guess it might have been via the exercise testing. Is that what happened?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened. As someone was a keen sportsman and then also enjoyed exercise, and I became really interested in exercise testing just before we went to Everest. So my PhD was looking at exercise capacity and performance at altitude. And I also took some muscle biopsies and looked at changes in mitochondrial function that were underlying those changes. So we did 2,500 exercise tests on Everest, and that's when I first
good at it.
competent at A, performing them, and B, interpreting them. And then we came back and we were very keen. It was part of our whole ethos for going was mountainside to bedside and how we would apply this research back in the UK. And I'm really proud to say, we did a lot of fundraising. Not surprisingly, the major grant giving bodies weren't particularly keen at funding us the first time we went out there because there was a suspicion amongst many people that it was all a great big jolly and not really serious research. The productivity from that expedition that Mike led was massive, and my work on the muscle biopsy and the changes in mitochondrial function, we subsequently followed up with work in Sherpas, who we showed had different oxygen use efficiency. And then Dan Martin and a PhD fellow then we have looked at that in patients in critical care and seen similar changes in people who adapt well and had better outcomes had the same changes in shifts in mitochondrial efficiency and use. I do believe what we did, it came back to the bedside. And another big area was in exercise testing. And this was about the same time it coincided with Paul Alder's work from Australia.
Yes.
And we in the UK really struggled with having access sometimes to get tests such as echoes, in a timely manner for people who needed major surgery. And we heard about Paul's work and loved this concept. And Paul came over and actually was a visiting prof and trained us all at UCH in cardiopulmonary exercise testing. And that's where I moved into. So when I finished my PhD, my first big clinical research study was looking at cardiopulmonary exercise testing and its ability to predict outcome. And the rest, as they say, is history, because, it became clear that less fit people did less well. And so the obvious next question was, can you train them? Everyone thought we were slightly crazy at the time and said that patients wouldn't do it. It was quite clear to us from our experience in the studies subsequently that patients would do it. But then it became really clear to me it's not just how the exercise works, it's how can you make the patient do it? Because it became clear that the next challenge was, designing programs that patients would do. And still there was a huge piece of work to convince people that it was an important thing. And during that period, I became really interested in the epidemiology of exercise. And, I talk a lot on exercise as medicine, but it's something I'm really passionate about because I think there's a huge issue with lifestyle-related disease. That is only going to get worse. If you look at the adolescent population, with the advent of more time spent on screen, there's a reduction in exercise and physical activity, and that has a long-term impact on health. And so I think it's hugely important. And we're very fortunate as perioperative physicians to have this time, a window of opportunity when I think patients are very susceptible in a way that they may not be at other points in their life to public health advice about changing behaviour.
So it's just amazing how you've done so many incredible things, and you really are one of the core group that established perioperative medicine, which is now an established specialty of medicine. So the immediate thing I think, and I'm sure all the listeners are thinking, is how do you fit all this in? You're fit, you still do loads of exercise, you travel and make inspiring speeches and you write papers and you lead CPOC and etc. And and you're a great example for women in medicine about, thinking big about what's possible, I think.
Thank you. That's very kind. I actually think it's a massive challenge, and I think it's one of those things. I haven't even talked about my family yet, other than that I married Mike Grocott, who is, not everybody knows that because I keep my professional name separate, but another part of my life has been the fact that both my clinical and research career have been with my husband. And that's an interesting challenge in and of itself sometimes. It's a really good thing because, for example, we're here in Marrakesh together. We're talking at this fantastic conference about perioperative care, but also a challenge because we have 3 children, which means they're home alone. Entertainingly enough, with my PhD supervisor, who is an exercise physiologist, who's a treasure and is helping them to revise for their exams. God bless her. But I do think it's a juggle as a woman. And I think, one of the things I think it's really important for, to be realistic at the beginning of your career, or not the beginning, but when you're trying to do both research, clinical work and medicine, and have a family and young children and home, you may well face the points in your career, and I feel this a lot even still now, that you're failing at one of the above, or you're not doing anything perfectly because you're always trying to balance those things. And I think that's fine, I think it's really easy to get into a sort of self-critical judgment bit about not being the perfect parent because you're not there at their sports matches, or not being such a great researcher because, as you know, Kate, I may not respond to my requests to review things incredibly quickly. So, I would say I do lots of things, but I don't do any of them absolutely perfectly. I think you can make choices about, staying in one particular area and focusing on it, which may make things a little bit easier. But I've really loved the breadth of my career, and I don't regret doing, a lot of things like clinical leadership, trying to change management, but supporting that with research. And I still love working with patients. I think that's a real privilege. and a big bit of what we do, both in critical care and in perioperative. But it's not easy. I think, what would I say? The things that have helped me, I think having role models help. I think early on, identifying somebody who works in a way that you admire and aspire to, that helps, and it means that you have something to ground you. I think, thankfully, women are becoming more prevalent than they were when I started as role models in academic medicine. And talking to them early in your career about the challenges they faced, or, between balancing work and home, because I think that is realistic, and realising, although there should not be barriers to women progressing, and there are less and less, I believe, but equally being realistic that if you are going to take time out, to, in fact, do expedition medicine or to look after young children for a bit full time, then all that will do is delay your progress for a bit. And I think that's actually reasonable. There's no reason why you should go at the same progress as somebody who's not taken any time out. You just need to have that not impacting your future opportunities. And I think that that's much better understood now, that you can have a career break for a little bit of time and then re-establish you. But I don't think anyone can do it perfectly. And I think you have to give yourself a break. I was speaking to a young academic recently who's just a clinical academic, a similar background, who's just had 3 children in 3 years, which is what I did. And, they're worried about work, they're worried about home. And I just said to her, you're never going to do it perfectly.
Yeah.
And if you want to carry on work, the other thing is you need good childcare. That might seem a bit obvious, but investing in that early on, for me, has been another really important element. We've been very lucky. We've only had 2 nannies in the last 17 years. And that means, sometimes that's a little bit hard because my children have a very close relationship with their nanny. But if you want to work, you have to balance these things. So set yourself up to be able to manage that. And I am slow at answering my email. And you know that. And I know that. But, sometimes I say I'm not going to answer my email. I don't answer my email at weekends because I want to spend that time with my kids because I don't see them during the week. And so, just accept that you can't be perfect.
And it's been marvellous to see both you and Mike around the world with one of your children on a special one-on-one trip. Yeah. You went on a great mountain biking trip in New Zealand with one of your sons.
Yeah. I think that's been really, really important for us as a family. And I think something I would advise for everyone to, particularly if you have 3 children or more, or lots of children, it's quite hard to find one-on-one time in the chaos that is everyday life. When we've managed to be invited somewhere near a school holiday, or sometimes we've actually broken the children out of school. Don't repeat that to anybody, but they've had it's been a really great experience for them and for us. So my daughter Sky's been to Australia with Mike. My son Connor's been mountain biking, and we did the Abel Tasman track together. And those opportunities have been really precious and make really precious memories for the kids. Last year, actually, I cycled to Paris with my daughter on my own, and that was a really great experience, actually not related to work at all.
How do you cycle to Paris from Southampton?
Well, we went from London.
There's a bit of water.
You get the train up to London to start. We started by the London Eye. We cycled down to Newhaven on the coast. You get a little ferry, so there's a bit of a cheat there. And then we cycled from Dieppe to Paris, which was great. Mike and I fortuitously have the same, pastime love of being in the wilderness. And our life is pretty frenetic. And so for us, a really important element for the family has been taking time and completely getting away from work. And these days, the email, constant noise, and is hard as an academic or as a leader. So we've made a real point of doing remote things with our children, getting off the beaten track. So after COVID, because we are both intensive care doctors, that was a hard time. We went to northern India, to Ladakh, for 2 months, took a bit of a sabbatical, moved to our clinical job, and spent 40 days in a tent, and the kids with no electricity, no screens, and we trekked, and the kids climbed a couple of 6,000 metre mountains, and we went over 10 5,000 metre passes. But it was spending that time just together, back to simplicity, no noise. We went to Namibia last year. The children trekked to Everest Base Camp when they were very small, 4, 5 and 7, I think. And those times have been really precious for us.
Well, it's been absolutely marvellous talking to you. I know you quite well, but I've learnt a lot of interesting things about what you've done and what's motivated you, and I'm sure our listeners are going to be fascinated and inspired. So thank you very, very much, Professor Denny Levett.
Thank you, Kate.
So you've been listening to TopMedTalk Perioperative Profiles. You can find this profile and all our other great profiles on our website. You can also download episodes via your favourite podcatcher. And you can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Blue Sky, we're on Twitter, and we're on LinkedIn. We'd like to thank our sponsors, who are BD, Advanced Patient Monitoring, and GE. And we'd like to thank the World Congress of Anaesthesiologists for their hospitality. Cheers.
TopMedTalk.
TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EPPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. Join clinicians from around the world at EPPOM World Congress 2026 between the 7th and the 9th of July at the British Library in London. 3 days of evidence-based perioperative medicine, global insights and expert debate, featuring speakers including Michael Marmot and Ken Rockwood. Go now to edpom.org. That's edpom.org.